Welcome to Humanities on the Road. Today we are at the Albright Memorial Library in Scranton for John Updike's Pennsylvania with Frank Fitzpatrick. I'm Tracy Matisak, and you know, Humanities on the Road is a collaboration. It's a joint venture, if you will, between the Pennsylvania Humanities Council and the Pennsylvania Cable Network. And the idea is to bring together people like you from all over the state to talk about history and the arts and the important ideas that shape our world. Of course, we want to extend special thanks to our host, the Albright Memorial Library. And you know, this library has been serving the citizens of Scranton and Lackawanna County since it first opened its doors in June of 1893. The library was given to the city by John J. Albright, who felt that it would be a fitting memorial to his parents, but also, as he put it, a blessing to the generations to come. Loosely patterned after the French Chateau Monastery Musée des Cluny, the library really is representative of the early Renaissance style. It's got a limestone exterior, tile roof, ornate carvings. The interior is finished in quartered oak, and it is absolutely fabulous. There are 3 fireplaces here and beautiful stained glass windows all throughout the building that depict in a really majestic way book bindings from centuries past, including those that were designed for Queen Elizabeth and Catherine de' Medici. Well, let me tell you a little bit about our speaker. Our speaker is Frank Fitzpatrick, who, of course, is a Commonwealth speaker with the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. He has been involved in the sports world for a number of years, but he is an expert on John Updike, and he is going to share with us his tremendous appreciation. He has read all of the acclaimed author's works, and he's got a lot to tell us about John Updike and also how Pennsylvania figured prominently into the work of John Updike. Frank has been working since 1980 with the Philadelphia Inquirer in a number of capacities. Currently, he is a beat writer for Penn State football, for the Phillies, and for the Eagles, which is a pretty darn good job if you can get it. Frank is himself the author of 3 books. He is also a 2001 Pulitzer Prize finalist, and he has won no less than 13 Associated Press awards for sports editors. So having said all that, please join me as we welcome our speaker, Frank Fitzpatrick.
As has been noted, I'm a Philadelphia sports writer, and I'm sure some of you are thinking, why someone from that notoriously cynical breed developed an interest so literary as John Updike. Good question. But I must tell you that Updike, too, dipped his toes into the sports writing pool. He grew up, as you know or are about to know, in the Reading area, and he was exposed to baseball initially through the Philadelphia A's and the Philadelphia Phillies. And if you're too young to recall, I'm sure, but in the years around World War II, those 2 teams were absolutely dreadful. So almost by default, he became a Red Sox fan, and he adored Ted Williams. Well, in 1960, he's an established author, and Williams is playing his final game at Fenway Park, an event that you might think was some momentous occasion, but in fact drew 10,000 fans to Fenway Park. But one of them was Updike, and he used the occasion to write a story about it for the New Yorker, and it's called Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu. Kid was Williams' nickname. And it was the only baseball story he ever wrote, and it's widely acclaimed, certainly by people in my profession, as probably the greatest sports story ever written. So the man wrote one sports story and, you know, hit it out of the park in Williams' language. But if any of you remember, you'll remember there's a line in it that says, Williams stubbornly refused to tip his cap to Boston fans at any time, even when he was wildly cheered. And Updike, he did it again in his last game, refused, and Updike said, "Gods don't answer letters," which is kind of a much quoted line of his. But anyway, as I said, the result of that story, that story, Hub Fans Bid Kid Adieu, is now out in book form. Matter of fact, it just was released within the month. So if any of you are interested in baseball, Ted Williams, or John Updike, you might want to go ahead and read that. But anyway, I'd like to give you a little introduction as to how I developed this kind of, my wife would say, unhealthy obsession with John Updike. So I'm going to give you a little context, and I'm going to read something I wrote soon after Updike died in 2009 that I think will let you know how I got started on this. Sports writer is a common noun. is a compound noun. Most of us as kids latched onto literary idols the way we fixated on famous first basemen. Sure, I could see myself as Ernie Banks, but I wanted just as badly to be Ernest Hemingway. The rat-a-tat rhythm of his prose had a peculiar power. It was clean, it was direct, it was good. And then I read John Updike. Updike was the anti-Hemingway. His sentences were elaborately layered concoctions, teeming with detail, metaphor, and an astonishing gracefulness. I read Rabbit Run in college and was hooked. I grew so enamored of my fellow Pennsylvanian that I spent the next 4 decades virtually stalking him. A reporter friend of mine once gave me Updike's phone number. I carried it in my wallet right alongside a Richie Allen autograph, though I never had enough courage or consumed enough alcohol to call. In 1972, just 4 years after the novel Couples kind of catapulted Updike to international celebrity, I got my first newspaper job in Reading, which was Updike's hometown and was Rabbit's milieu and the setting of so much of the author's prose. Well, not long before, Reading had been the locale for the movie version of Rabbit Run, an awful film, by the way. And soon I was running across the Penn Street Bridge, drinking beer at the Woodward Cafe, both of which James Caan did in the film. The newsroom I roamed was where Updike had worked during his 3 post-war summers as probably history's most overqualified copy boy. There were still a few old-timers around who remembered him, and talking to them and reading carefully, I began to unearth the people and places he'd so thinly disguised in his fiction, in his novels, in his short stories. I journeyed to nearby Shillington and Plowville, Olinger and Firetown in his fictional world, the 2 towns where he divided his childhood. I even went to his barber, Luther Hornberger, an immaculately groomed man whose garrulousness belied his Pennsylvania Dutch heritage. I talked to his classmates, explored the family gravesite. I found Updike's original boyhood home, a white stucco corner house, and admired the famous dogwood tree in its yard. His family had planted that tree on the day Updike, an only child of an only child mother, was born. But Updike wrote about that tree in one of his famous biographical essays called A Dogwood Tree. When I was young, my parents and my mother's parents planted a dogwood tree in the side yard of the large white house in which we lived throughout my boyhood. This tree, I learned quite early, was exactly my age, was, in a sense, me, but I never observed it closely. I'm not now sure what color its petals were. Its presence was no more distinct than that of my shadow. The tree was my shadow, and had it died, had it ceased to occupy each year with increasing volume and brilliance its place in the side yard, I would have felt it a blessing, like the blessing of light had been withdrawn from my life. Anyway, when my children were old enough, we'd pile them into the minivan, and with my wife reading the appropriate passages, drive them through the real-life settings of his fiction. Once parked outside his mother's farmhouse, I turned to see Updike striding toward me. Not sure whether he'd mistaken me for an expected visitor or an intruder, I sped away like an interrupted burglar. I lingered on occasion in the nearby barn, the setting for perhaps my favorite scene in Updike's work, the spiritually poignant conclusion to his story Pigeon Feathers, in which his fictional surrogate, a teenage boy named David, is gripped by existential angst until he sees the luminous feathers of a pigeon he has killed fall from the barn's rafters. I was going to develop a series of signals to let you know when I was going to quote Updike, but I felt that was kind of presumptuous. If you can't distinguish between my words and Updike's, well, I don't think anybody will have any problem, believe me. But anyway, these are Updike's words. He was robed in this certainty that the God who had lavished such craft upon these worthless birds would not destroy his whole creation by refusing to let David live forever. Even in the eulogy I gave following my own mother's passing, I borrowed heavily from the O. Henry Award-winning story, A Sandstone Farmhouse, which Updike had written in wake of his own mother's death. In it, a man is having difficulty dealing with his mother's death, having difficulty mourning, until he sees a photo of her as a young woman. His tears came and kept coming in a kind of triumph, a breakthrough, a torrent of empathy and pity for that lost young woman running past the Pennsylvania row houses, under the buttonwood trees, running to catch the trolley, the world of the 30s, shabby and solid around her, the porches, the blue midsummer hydrangeas, this tiny, well-dressed figure in her diminishing pocket of time, her future unknown, her death, her farm, far from her mind. Twice I'd gotten to ask Updike questions, once during a Q&A portion of his lecture at Montgomery County Community College, another time over the phone when he was a guest on Larry King's old afternoon radio show. He was polite on both occasions, joyfully so in the second, when my query allowed him to expound on his beloved father, so memorably portrayed in his work. Still, I never really met the man. And then, 7 years ago, on our 30th wedding anniversary, my wife and I were walking through Washington's National Art Gallery with our children when I saw Updike approaching. Since we were there as part of a weekend anniversary celebration the kids had planned, I momentarily assumed they had managed the greatest gift ever. But once I determined it was merely serendipity, my son, having been witness to my obsession, insisted I stop the man and speak to him. Updike was with two older women, and with his caliky hair amiss and his casual clothes badly wrinkled, looked surprisingly ordinary. As I hominid Ralph Cramden style, my son pushed me toward him. "Mr. Updike," I said, "I'm a huge fan. Love the Centaur. Worked at the Reading Times." Hell of a time to channel Hemingway, I thought. He was polite, and we chatted amiably about Reading and his father for a few minutes. My son took a grainy, out-of-focus photo. I lost that photo on the January day he died, when my computer, perhaps in sympathy, crashed. A week or so later, I discovered a copy. But Updike died of lung cancer in January of 2009, which curiously was the same month that Pennsylvania lost another artistic giant, Andrew Wyeth. Updike undoubtedly would have found it interesting that he died at the age of 76, a number so closely associated with his beloved home state. His lifetime of work was truly prodigious. 27 novels, 14 short story collections, 10 books of poetry, 10 volumes of essays, literary criticism, book reviews, articles in any magazine you can think of. Obituaries hailed him as modern America's greatest man of letters, a 20th century Hawthorne. He also was described, correctly I believe, as perhaps the finest pure wordsmith that America has ever produced. The New York Times once referred to his sentences as tiny miracles of transubstantiation. Perhaps because he wrote so beautifully, some criticized him as a novelist for failing to tackle the big issues of his time. Indeed, his focus rarely strayed beyond his own life and surroundings, and a set of interests that included theology, art, golf, and sex. It's clear the notion that he wasn't always aiming for the great American novel irritated Updike, who once said, "There's a constant feeling that if you're not writing Moby Dick, you're just clowning around." He preferred, he once noted, to give the mundane its beautiful due. For those of you not familiar with Updike's fictional output, I think it's safe, certainly for the purpose of this little talk, to place that work into two categories: the Pennsylvania stories and novels, of which you have the 4 Rabbit novels. You've got Of the Farm, The Centaur, The Poorhouse Fair, and dozens of short stories, and everything else. Updike was, of course, a proud Pennsylvanian. "I was very fortunate to be a Pennsylvanian," he said not long before his death. "The state has an authentic taste, a life-perfect, weather-perfect location." He must have, I'm not sure about that weather-perfect, but perhaps on a day like this you can see what he was talking about. For 18 years, an astonishingly short time when you think of all the brilliance it yielded over the next 58, he completely absorbed his little corner of Berks County. Critics frequently compared his powerful sense of place to Faulkner's. And more than most writers, he made the detail of his life the subject of his work. He has insistently translated his own family and his own geography into the universalities of literature. A former Inquirer colleague of mine, Bill Eckenbarger, wrote in 1983. It was an Inquirer magazine profile. I'm sure some of you might remember the Inquirer magazine, but its demise and the state of newspapers is a topic for another day. For me, it seems, the more you learned about Updike's life, the more you recognized it in his books. Much of what he wrote and described was factual. Only the names and locales were changed to protect the innocent. There were times when he acknowledged that, and other occasions when he denied it. I feel no obligation to the remembered past," he said in 1968. "What I create on paper must, and for me does, soar free of whatever the facts were." I think unlike Updike, most Pennsylvanians don't have a real strong